My name is Nick. I have the privilege of serving as one of the pastors here on staff. I want to start our time with a question. In the famous Christmas song, Joy to the World, there's this line that speaks of repeating the sounding joy. And I want to ask you, what does joy sound like? What is the sound of joy? Maybe it's literal music. I'm not musically inclined, so as much as I appreciate music and those who love music, to me, joy does not always sound like music. Maybe for you, it's pure silence. Maybe it's the voice of a child. For me, when I think about the sound of joy, I think about the rail of my surfboard slicing through the open face of the water with the wave crashing gently behind me. That's what joy is to me. What is joy to you? As we observe Advent, which means arrival or coming, it's this season of expectation, not so much looking in the past, but more looking toward the future. What will God continue to do in our midst? Where will Jesus show up in the future? What are we looking forward to? In this season of Advent, we traditionally observe four characteristics. Characteristics really of Jesus. This is the embodiment of God in the flesh. We think about hope. Where do we need hope? We think about peace. Where do we need peace in our lives? Today we're talking about joy, and next week we're going to be talking about the unconditional love of God, something that I think the human heart craves, and which really we only find complete fulfillment in God. But I think one of the challenges, if we're really honest, when we think about this season of Advent, is that there's this mixture. On one hand, we think about the beautiful elements of hope, of joy, of peace, of love. On the other hand, I know that this can be a very painful time for people. It's a reminder of perhaps what we've lost, or what isn't right, what isn't hopeful, what isn't peaceful. I know specifically in our community, we have experienced loss in the past month or so. In fact, in our host church, our sister church, First Baptist, we have experienced loss. And so I simply want to honor that. I want to name that and recognize that we're holding both in tension in this Advent season. And I think that's the beauty of Jesus, is that it's not a denial of all that is wrong in the world. It's in fact an embracing of it and recognition that God breaks through the darkness with the light of Jesus. And we hold both of those together in this season. In fact, when we look at the two gospel accounts of Jesus' birth, one in the Gospel of Matthew and one in the Gospel of Luke, which we just heard through the children, we also see this dichotomy, this kind of beautiful picture of what is God doing as he breaks into the darkness through the person of Jesus. So we're going to spend some time in the Gospel of Matthew looking at a Christmas passage that sometimes doesn't get a lot of play. You probably wouldn't watch a Charlie Brown Christmas special on this perspective on the Nativity. So just to set the stage a little bit, many of us are familiar with the virgin birth, that God reveals himself to Mary and to Joseph in unique, miraculous ways and saying, even though you are a virgin, you're going to bear a child. And this child will be, in fact, God embodied in the flesh, which already, if that isn't jarring enough, hard to believe enough, the story continues. The historical backdrop here is that King Herod is ruling Israel. And just a little bit of background, the king in Israel was supposed to represent God's intermediary between God's holiness, God's majesty, God's power, and the people of Israel, God's chosen people, his representation, his light to the world. But unfortunately, the history of Israel is one of corruption and selfishness and fragile egos. And King Herod falls right into this trope, right into this description of these rulers who misrepresented God, misrepresented this nation. Herod rebuilt the temple, which was supposed to be the most holy place on earth. This was supposed to represent God with his people. And we read in Matthew chapter 2 this really interesting narrative of these men called the Magi. We assume that there's three, but the text doesn't really tell us that there's three. In our songs, we call them the wise men, but we really don't know much about them. All we know is that they are not from Israel. So in other words, they are non-believers. They are outside of the house of faith that is central to this narrative. And they come following this star. So there's this kind of otherworldly astronomical phenomenon that they're following, that they're compelled to follow and to worship. And so it takes them from the east to Jerusalem, and they come to this King Herod, this corrupt, egotistical leader, and say, hey, we're here because we follow this star, and we're here to worship the new king of the Jews. And of course, you can imagine if you're Herod, that probably raises your blood pressure. Like, king, I'm the king. Like, who? There's this new king? No, there's no king here but me. And so in his violence and in his paranoia, he begins to craft this plan of like, well, if there is this new king who threatens my rule and my power, there's something that I must do about it. So he tells these magi, these men from the east, and scholars think that they're probably from Persia, and he tells them, oh, go and find this king, and then come back and tell me about this king, because I too want to go and worship this king. And many of us are familiar with the story that Magi eventually find Jesus, this baby. They bring him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and that's where we assume that there were three of them, but we don't really know. And then somehow, God speaks to them in a dream and says, don't go back to Herod. Go back to your home another way. And so that's what they do. And this is where the story picks up. So this is Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. When they had gone, the Magi, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. So that's from the prophet Hosea. Verse 16. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem and its vicinity, who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. So there's this deep tragedy. There's this violence that arises from the light of God breaking into the darkness. It's what we talked about last week when we looked at what the Gospel of John describes in the very beginning. That in Jesus was the light of life. But the darkness did not understand the light. And so the darkness in Herod, the darkness in what is represented in fallen humanity, in empire, in many of the institutions that we see to this day, there's this violent reaction to the light. And so Herod commands this genocide, that all boys under the age of 2 would be killed in order to eliminate any threat to Herod's legacy. And we know from secular historians that this was not uncommon or uncharacteristic for King Herod. This is something that he did. He would kill not just innocent babies, but he would kill members of his own family in order to maintain his power, his authority. And so we have this picture of Jesus' childhood. We don't know a lot about Jesus' childhood, but we see here this picture of Jesus fleeing to Egypt in his most vulnerable state. I mean, if you can just think a little bit of if you were God and you wanted to reveal yourself to humanity, how would you do that? What would that look like? And if I were God, and I'm glad that I'm not, I would choose a more comfortable way to do that. You know, maybe I don't have to be rich, but maybe middle class, maybe something comfortable, not extreme poverty, not growing up in a foreign country as a refugee, as an immigrant, to parents who were not married, who had no social status, who would probably spend the majority of his childhood with this stigma that you were born out of wedlock. Why would God choose to reveal himself to humanity in this way? Why would God himself in the flesh choose to suffer in this way? To give up the comforts that he could have had? And I think there's this really important picture here when we look at the Gospel of Matthew and we look at the Gospel of Luke. On one hand, it's undeniable that Jesus' early years were marked by loss of identity, loss of belonging, loss of a home. But on the other side, many theologians make the argument that Jesus, as the full embodiment of humanity and God, was likely the most joyous person that had ever lived. That when we read through the Sermon on the Mount and we see these countercultural portrayals of what it means for humanity to flourish, this is something that Jesus not only taught, he embodied. And people were drawn to him. Even though he had no money, had no political power, definitely had no military power, there was this beauty, this draw, this magnetic joy that likely resonated from his being. And so in Jesus, we see the extremes of suffering, of loss, with immense joy. And I think this speaks to our cultural moment as Americans. I think sometimes we are fed a narrative in American Christianity that it's all joy, that it's all happiness, that God has won, and so any form of sorrow, perhaps, or suffering is no longer relevant. But when we look at the larger biblical picture of what God does in the history of humanity, we see both. And I think that's important for us to internalize and to remember. I asked this question last week as we journeyed through this season of Advent, as we grapple with this imagery of light in the darkness. I asked, where is your darkness? What darkness perhaps sits over you? Maybe if you're like me, it could be as simple as shorter days and colder weather. And when I'm outside and it's 5 p.m. and the sun is gone, I just think, I don't like this time of year. Maybe it runs a little bit deeper, that there's something about the expectation of the holiday season, the gifts that you still need to buy, the gatherings that you have to go to that you don't really want to go to, that just kind of weighs on you. Maybe you think about relationships that are estranged or broken or fraught. Maybe you've experienced a recent death or loss, and there's a heaviness to your family, to your soul right now. Or maybe it's this vague feeling of abandonment, of fear, of loneliness. And I invite you this morning to simply name that before God as a form of prayer. What is that for you? And as we think about the incarnation, which is what Christmas is really about, it's God revealing himself to humanity. Who is God? What is he like? And that's what we see in Jesus. And yes, there is a cute children's version, which I think has its place, but there's a much deeper version of the incarnation that I think we are invited to remember, to ponder, and ultimately to hope in. In my office at the church office, I have this monstera plant. And I'm not great with plants, but there's something beautiful about this particular plant because it kind of seems like it's alive sometimes. It continually moves toward wherever the light is shining in. And so I kind of have to rotate it every few weeks, have to make sure that the blinds are open kind of at the right time. And it is a little bit finicky that if I'm not there for a couple days and I don't open the blinds, the leaves turn brown. I mean, those of you that know plants are probably like, well, yeah, duh, of course. But to me, there's something profound about kind of that movement, that life in my office. And there's this gradual but noticeable movement or this leaning toward the light. And I think there's something within the fabric of creation and the natural world that speaks to us as human beings in the human experience. That in the darkness, we as people will gravitate toward the light, toward that which is good, that which is life-giving. And so I don't know where you may be at in your faith, in your personal journey, but the invitation that I have for you this morning is that you would simply lean toward the light. What in your soul do you know is good and true and compelling? Much like the Magi coming from a foreign country into a faith and a culture that they did not have words for, but they felt compelled to follow this star. What is that for you? What does it mean for you to lean into the light, wherever you may be at, perhaps in your darkness? I'll be honest, I am not naturally a very joyful person. And as I sat with our staff this week to celebrate the year and share a meal together, I just asked, like, what do you think we need as a congregation? And it was kind of a no-brainer, but Pastor Kevin kind of pointed out, like, I think this week's theme of joy makes sense. I think it's relevant. I think it's what we need. Would you preach on joy? And I kind of sat with that for a little bit, and I thought, like, I don't feel joyful. And especially as I sit with certain members of our congregation who are suffering loss, there's something in me that's like, I don't sense that. I don't resonate with that right now. But as I kind of prayed through this, I was reminded of this image of leaning toward the light. And one of our congregants had sent me something that she had been working on that incorporated a reflection on different sermon series that I had given over the past 3 years. And I've been here for about 3 years, which is kind of hard to believe. But the first year I was here, I preached through this sermon series called The Pursuit of Joy. And the interesting thing about my role is that I pour myself into these sermons, and then I totally forget what I teach about. And so I went back and I started looking at some of these sermon notes, and what I did that spring was I took the latest scientific research on human thriving and happiness and the findings there, and kind of overlaid that over the biblical narrative. You know, what do we believe as Christians? And surprisingly, there's quite a bit of overlap. And what it's in contrast to is so much of the cultural current that we're pulled toward money and reputation and status, and so much of the digital world that consumes us is based on that. And it's intuitive for us. It's like, we know that doesn't contribute to human thriving, to happiness. Yet, when we look at the way of Jesus, when we look at the scientific research that talks about human flourishing, why is it so hard to do that which gives us life? And we looked at what it looks like practically to cultivate joy in our individual lives, but also in our communities. And again, this isn't rocket science. Like, you kind of look at it and it's like, well, yeah, duh. But then when I think about my own life, I think, yeah, I need to do more of that. And so I wanted to share just 7 basic practices that I pulled out of this old sermon series as a reminder for my own anxious, depressed soul. So we can go to the next slide. So first was lean into community. I'm just curious, who's an introvert like me? Oh, quite a few. That's affirming to hear. So introvert means basically I recharge by being alone. When I think about the sound of joy, for me it's silence. It's being alone. And I love my family, love my girls, but sometimes the most beautiful, peaceful moment in my day is when they're off to school, my wife goes to work, and I have this moment of just pure silence. And I know we're not all the same. Some people love the kind of the coffee shop feel, or they love being at like a concert, or church is life-giving. And so for some of us, community is hard. But there's something undeniable about the way that people cultivate joy in our lives. And that looks different for different people. For some, it's simply just come to church, just show up. For others, it's calling that friend saying, hey, it's been a while, can we grab coffee or a drink or just a meal together? Whatever that looks like for you, lean into that. Secondly, at the core of what we call the good news of Christianity, there is this invitation to be adopted into God's family through Jesus the Christ. And this is so easy to forget, but at the core of that transformation is this adoption, that we, as God's beloved, are adopted into his family. The way that many of us feel about our kids, that's the way God feels about you. Do you remember that? Can you own that? Does that resonate with your soul? Thirdly, there's this invitation in the way of Jesus to practice forgiveness on a regular basis. It's in the Lord's Prayer. Lord, forgive me, teach me to forgive others. And I get it, it's not easy. It's not easy for me. But there's something about human flourishing that requires us to practice forgiveness. And then fourth, choose connection over comparison. This goes back to the community piece. That everything about social media and everything that preceded social media points us toward this discontentment with our lives. Well, this person has this, has accomplished this, looks like this. Who am I? And so resist that. Find a way to connect with people rather than compare yourself to them or compete with them. And this happens on a micro level, so be aware of that. What's going on in your soul? Number 5, practice gratitude. All of the secular research points to this practice. And if you're a journaler like me, you like to write things in analog, simply writing down the things that we are grateful for, that makes our lives full, is good for the soul. Number 6, pursue calling over ego. This is kind of a personal one for me when I think about how I spend my time, how I use my energy and my resources. Does it feed an ego? Does it feed vanity? Or is there something deeper? Is there something meaningful that I'm pursuing in my everyday life? Whether that be the conversations that I have, the people I spend it with, or the things that sometimes I consume, whether that's media or food, the thoughts that I entertain. So pursue a life of meaning and significance over that which really doesn't matter. And then number 7, this is something that we've been practicing and trying to work out in our context here at Palos Verdes Baptist, is to simply practice Sabbath. For me, this looks like every Friday I don't check email. Wherever I happen to be in my ministry to-do list, I just set it aside. And it's this really important practice of recognizing I don't have it all together. There is this God that I rely on and that I simply pause before to worship, to enjoy, and to rest. It's something that we have tried practicing here every time we have a fifth Sunday, where we don't have a traditional service, but we come together, take communion, and I release you to simply be with God. If you're an introvert, I say go take a walk in the hiking trails, spend some time in here in prayer. If you're an extrovert, grab that coffee and that donut and just get to know people. Spend an extended amount of time in conversation, unrushed, unhurried. Practice Sabbath. Enjoy. And that itself is countercultural, to have a day where you're not producing and achieving and consuming. So my encouragement as you look at these practices is just choose one this week and make an effort to lean into that. One of the things that I do in my practice to, one, stay sane, but also to cultivate a personal relationship with this mysterious creator God, is that I take these walks. And of course, here in Palos Verdes, we're blessed with places like this where we can go and we can actually watch the sunset over water, which is amazing. And there's always something in that's sacred to me, that I believe that God meets me in. And whatever that looks like for you, I invite you to lean into that, to lean in toward the light. As we close, I'm going to invite the choir back up. As a prayer, I'm going to read from a children's book, because sometimes children's literature speaks to our souls. So would you receive this as a prayer? You can close your eyes if you want. Prepare your hearts to sing. This is from a book called Sounding Joy by Ellie Holcomb. What does joy sound like? Is it quiet like snow? Does joy sound like the laughter of friends that you know? Is joy like the sound of a kiss on your cheek? Or like holding your breath when you play hide and seek? Maybe joy sounds real loud, like hip, hip, hooray. Or a whispered, I love you, at the end of the day. Joy sounds a little like all of these things. But a long time ago, joy sounded like wings. If you can imagine on a dark winter's night, the sky filled with angels, all shining with light. And suddenly the shepherds and sheep down below were surrounded by songs from that heavenly host. Glory to God and peace to all men. The angels, they sang it again and again. There is good news. God bent down low and sent us his son to make heaven our home. So every Christmas, we string up the lights to remember the way that those angels shone bright. And we sing all the songs and we bang all the drums to remember the night that God sent his son. Glad tidings, great joy. We are never alone. The songs will remind us we all have a home. So every Christmas, each girl and each boy can lift up their voice and repeat, sounding joy. Amen.